Today, we're going to, of course, talk about the Reconstruction era. I'm going to get into that, talk about the post-Civil War period. Of course, one of the things I will talk about today, which is famous, of course, I'll talk about the Abraham Lincoln assassination. Like I said, that altered, obviously, Reconstruction. Probably would have been totally different, if I guess Lincoln wouldn't have been shot, more or less. So yeah, we're going to go ahead and talk about Reconstruction today, which Reconstruction goes from 1865 to 1877. Of course, if you saw my announcement I gave you the other day, I did give you a PowerPoint lecture that I've got up right now. I think it might be a little different from yours, but I think I put that new cover page into it right there you're looking at. But that first lecture goes into like the Reconstruction era. I think it covers also up to like the Abraham Lincoln assassination and all that. So you should already see that already posted right now. What was the Reconstruction era? Or like, first of all, why did it happen, the Reconstruction era? Well, obviously, if you took the previous class before this, the first half of American history, obviously the reason why Reconstruction happened was because of the Civil War, which happened over like a 4-year period between 1861 and 65, where the North fought the South. The Union side versus the Confederate side. And obviously, the Union side won the war. The North won. And so the South needed to be reconstructed, after the war. And of course, there are all kinds of theories about, why or how, I guess, the South needed to be reconstructed more or less. I'm going to kind of go in today and talk about all the different theories that they had, about how they wanted to reconstruct it, because there are differences between what the president wanted, like Lincoln and Andrew Johnson wanted, versus what the U.S. Congress wanted. So both wanted kind of control over Reconstruction, because there are different theories about why the war happened and basically who was involved in it and so on. Now, I do have other slides, of course, I'll be kind of moving down through, of course, later, which I'll talk about. I'll first talk about Abraham Lincoln, because Lincoln had his own ideas about Reconstruction that he had. I can blow these up for you if you want to look at larger right here, but he had his own ideas about Reconstruction. It's often called the 10% plan. It was this idea where basically he came up with the idea in the 1860s during the Civil War that 10% of the voters from like 1860 in a state, if they could just take an oath to like the Union, then the state could be readmitted, basically, as a official state, the United States. So that's one thing that they did as well. And he had also this other idea, too, that he would offer pardons to certain Confederates if they would take an oath to the Union, and also to end slavery, but only certain ones that were like lower ranking, like maybe in the military or whatever. But he wasn't going to basically allow, like, some of the generals like Robert E. Lee and some of the people in the government of the Confederacy to, I think they weren't going to pardon them. That's what it was. So his was kind of lenient, though. His idea for Reconstruction, it was not very popular, and some of the members of Congress wanted to basically have something more stringent, and so some of the Republicans, moderate and some of the radical Republicans, later as they're called, had their own ideas about Reconstruction, which the main one you see there was the so-called Wade-Davis bill that was developed also during the Civil War. It was developed by these two men you see there. One was named Senator Benjamin Wade of Ohio, and also Representative Henry Winter Davis of Maryland. Those are the two that actually developed the bill, Wade-Davis, which never came to fruition as an actual act. But it was designed mostly to aid African Americans, to get them, more rights, obviously. Get them citizenship and things like that, which we'll see later. The idea with it, and that particular bill didn't really go anywhere, and It also included this thing in it, which is very, very, I don't think it shows that one right there or that slide right there, but it had this thing in it called the Ironclad Oath you may have heard about, where Southerners, they had to take an oath that they had never fought or supported the Confederacy, which would take out a lot of people, in the South. So they wanted to try to limit the amount of Southerners that could have any right to like vote, power, or anything like that after the war. And they're going to try to give more rights to people that were either former slaves or people that had been against the Confederacy and all that. So that was the whole point of what they were trying to do with that. Now there are different theories. And by the way, what happened to that bill? It never came into fruition as an actual act because Lincoln pocket vetoed it. He basically wouldn't sign it. And so because Congress wasn't in session, what happened was the bill just expired. It didn't become a law, and so it never happened. Then they have like these different theories on Reconstruction, which obviously dealt with like the Southern states, like statuses, because of the war and Reconstruction and all that. There were two main theories on Reconstruction. I told you, from the perspective of the presidents like Lincoln and Johnson versus, say, the Republicans, especially the radical Republicans. In the one side, like on the presidents, they viewed basically the fact that the war had been like a rebellion of individuals, not states. That's what Lincoln and Johnson actually believed about that. And then the radical Republicans had their own theories about the war, that they had rebelled as states. And the radical Republicans had two main theories that they had. They had Thaddeus Stevens, who was, by the way, a Pennsylvanian senator. He had his own theory. And then Charles Sumner, who was a representative from Massachusetts. Actually, I'm sorry, Thaddeus Stevens was a representative of Pennsylvania. Charles Sumner was a senator of Massachusetts. They had their own theories on, what happened. They thought that basically Congress ought to control the policies of Reconstruction of the South, not the president. And so what was the difference between the two in their theories? Well, talk about Charles Sumner first, senator from Massachusetts, who, by the way, was a big, he had been big abolitionist, by the way, before the war. He basically had what they call the state suicide argument. He believed that basically when the Civil War happened, the states had committed suicide when they left the Union. And that what that meant was that they would have to come in as like a territory, like before, and under like, I guess the U.S. Constitution or whatever, pretty much Congress controlled that. If we would come in as a state and all that. And then Thaddeus Stevens had his own idea too, which he had this other idea that these states that had rebelled had actually been conquered, so-called conquered province or provinces theory that he had. And Thaddeus Stevens of Pennsylvania believed that these states in the South ought to be reconstructed militarily. So military rule, a military governor with like troops and all like that, which is actually what happens in Reconstruction. Now, like I said, well, a lot of this didn't happen like it should have, because one of the things that happened, of course, with Lincoln was that, of course, as you know, Lincoln got assassinated. He got shot, of course, in April of 1865. Like I told you previously at the beginning of the lecture, that this basically, it altered, the policy's outcome of Reconstruction. And by the way, Lincoln is the first of four presidents that have been assassinated. You probably know the other ones, hopefully, that have also been killed. But the other three that have been assassinated was James Garfield. He was killed in 1881. William McKinley was shot in 1901. He was killed. Then John F. Kennedy, one of the most famous ones, was killed in 1963. So you've had basically, in a matter of like 100 years, you've had four presidents that have been assassinated. I think that of the two, Lincoln and Kennedy are the two most famous that have been assassinated. And of course, who shot him? You, of course, may have heard of this man that, of course, ended up shooting him. He was a farmer, basically an actor that eventually killed him. Who, of course, you see there is John Wilkes Booth. He, of course, the man, of course, that would kill Lincoln. And he shot Lincoln on April 14th, 1865, at Ford's Theater, which is a former theater that's in Washington, D.C. Now it's a museum, of course, because of it. And Lincoln had been an actor for years. He was famous for acting like in the North and in the South. He was from, of course, Virginia. He was a big supporter, by the way, of the Confederacy. Actually, never fought for the Confederacy. There's a possibility that some people think or theorize that he may have been a spy for the Confederacy at one point, more or less. And it's often called different names. The association with Booth with the assassination of Lincoln is often known as the Lincoln Conspiracy. It's called this because it wasn't just supposed to be an assassination. I think there was a plan of Booth and some of his conspirators to actually kidnap Lincoln. They were hoping to take Lincoln and bring him to the South in the Confederacy and force the North to surrender and end the war, something like that. Was a theory. Hey Taylor, what's going on this afternoon? Hey, but anyway, of course, we're talking about the Lincoln assassination, of course, at the beginning of the Reconstruction era, and so it's part of the so-called Lincoln conspiracy. Of course, Booth was involved in. There are a lot of people involved. It wasn't just like one person. It wasn't like Lee Harvey Oswald or something like that, where I think pretty much all the other assassinations were one person that shot basically Lincoln, but of course he did too, but there was other people that were involved a lot, they believe. And these were the main conspirators that were very famous that were involved. You had, of course, Mary Surratt, of course. You had Lewis Powell, who's sometimes called Lewis Payne, all the way. George Azarat, and then David Harrell. Those are some of the main ones that were involved. You can see there later on, those, by the way, 4 were all later put on trial as being involved in the Lincoln conspiracy. And they were, of course, later executed in July of 1865, a few months later overall. Lincoln, by the way, and I'll get more into that conspiracy thing, but Lincoln, by the way, was in the middle of like watching a play at Ford's Theater, which you may have heard of the play. I think they talked about it or not in the video, but the name of the play was called Our American Cousin, which I think was actually written by an English playwright. By the way, yeah, it was originally. And as he was watching from the presidential balcony, that's where, of course, he gets shot, as you know. And the other people with him were, of course, Mary Todd Lincoln was with him, of course. There were also 2 other people with him as well. You can see Henry Rathbone was with him, who was a major in the Union Army in the war. And Clara Harris, who was sitting with him, was, I believe, his fiance. Most people don't know it, but actually, Ulysses S. Grant was supposed to be there. He was actually supposed to be there with Lincoln to watch the play, but for some reason he had to cancel and couldn't make it. And so Rathbone and his fiance went instead. They got a pretty good view of that play, you know. So anyway, so Lincoln is shot, of course, and I think, of course, you saw in the video how Booth used this 6-inch Derringer, which he shot Lincoln. And how was Booth able to get into the presidential balcony and all that? Well, there was a guard that was guarding the entrance of the door. Well, the guard apparently left to get like I think a drink of alcohol or something like that. And so he left it unattended. And so Booth just walked up there and shot him. And of course, everybody knew who Booth was. He was famous. He was a famous actor. And nobody thought he's going to kill the president. They thought maybe he's going to go visit the president maybe and shake hands with him or something like that. But nobody knew who was going to actually shoot him. So, Booth gets shot. Booth shoots Lincoln, and basically after he shoots him, what he does, they didn't really talk about that in the video, but He then stabs Rathbone, and then after he stabs him, he jumps over the balcony. If you know about this, he catches his leg on the balcony, breaking, I think I want to say his left leg, I think, was broken, I think, when he stepped onto the stage, basically. And before he left the actual building, like Ford's Theater, one of the things that Booth supposedly said before he ran off was he said the famous statement, which was "Sic semper tyrannis," which, of course, is this famous motto of Virginia, which is "Thus always the tyrants." You may have heard of. However, there's another theory that he also said something else, like before he ran out of the theater. And of course, that was, he said something like, "The South is avenged." And then he ran outside, and what happened was there was this man named Edmund Spangler, who was like a stagehand. I think he was also a carpenter at Ford's Theater. He actually was tending basically Booth's horse. And so he later got implicated in the conspiracy and also was later in prison for it. They didn't put him to death, but he was in prison for it, and spent a big debate about whether Spangler was really involved in it or not, like the Lincoln conspiracy and all that. By the way, the other ones which I mentioned before in the Lincoln conspiracy, Mary Surratt, why was she important? She owned a boarding house in Washington, D.C., and that's where all the conspirators met to actually, hatch the plan or whatever to kill Lincoln and all that, or kidnap him. The other men, too, that were there, Lewis Powell, or Payne was another one. He actually was supposed to go and kill William Seward, who was the Secretary of State. He actually did go to his house, and I think he tried to shoot him with 2 pistols, but they misfired. So I think he just beat him up, is all he did. So he wasn't able to kill him. He didn't kill him. Then George Azarat, also, he was supposed to go and kill Andrew Johnson, who was the vice president, who was staying, by the way, in a local hotel. There was no vice presidential White House at that time. And so he went there, and instead what happened was Azarat he hung out in the saloon, I think, in the hotel, and he got drunk, and he lost his nerve. He never went up there and tried to kill Johnson or whatever. So, yeah, they could have taken out all the top 3 guys, Lincoln, Johnson, and the Secretary of State Seward, all in one swoop. There's been, of course, a lot of theories about, if this was just the brainchild of Booth, or was it something bigger? Was somebody else behind it? Was the Confederacy behind it? They don't really know. There's a big debate about that, about what happened. Oh, David Harold, by the way, he's important too. David Harold helped the other guy, which was, I told you, I think it was Lewis Powell or Payne. He helped him find William Seward's house, and then also David Harold also helped Booth escape from Maryland into basically what is Virginia. He knew which way to go. And what happened was he brought, because of the fact that Booth had hurt himself, he brought him to this house of Dr. Samuel Mudd in Virginia. I think I've got some pictures of Samuel Mudd here, who was later implicated in the assassination right here. They're not sure if Booth knew Mudd, but they think that David Harold knew him. And so he brought him there, and he was able to fix, of course, Booth's left leg that was broken. And later they found the actual boot of Booth that was left there. And so Mudd was later, like I said, implicated in the conspiracy as well. He was eventually imprisoned for it for several years, but was later pardoned in 1869 by Andrew Johnson. A lot of people think he didn't know what was going on. He actually knew about the assassination, I think, that occurred, but he didn't. I don't think he knew Booth, as far as they know. And he was pardoned because he was a doctor. And I think he had helped a lot of people that had malaria when he was in prison. And so they let him go for good behavior. That's what happened. And so That's Dr. Samuel Mudd. And Mudd, by the way, had a thing I think supposedly he said that's famous, that's well known. He said something like, "My name is Mudd." That's the famous quote. "My name is Mudd." Anyway, so what happened to Booth and also David Harold? Well, they were eventually surrounded in a tobacco barn in what is Bowling Green. It was a so-called farm of the Garrett family. They had some kind of tobacco plantation. That's in Bowling Green, Virginia. And what happened was U.S. troops found him and also David Harold, and they asked him to surrender, like to come out. And Harold did. Harold surrendered to, of course, the military forces, but Booth refused to basically surrender. And the sergeant crept around the side of the barn and fired at him, like shot, I think just one time or something at him, and I think hit him in the neck. And it ended up killing Booth, who died, by the way, on April 26th, 1865. I do have a picture of Boston Corbett, who kind of became like, I guess, kind of like a hero because he had killed Lincoln's assassin and all that. And supposedly when they dragged Booth to the nearby farmhouse of the Garrett family there, Booth looked at his hands and said something like, "Useless, useless." And that was his last words that John Wilkes Booth said. Something that is famous about Booth, I believe they did find a diary on him. You may have heard about this, or they found a diary that's associated with John Wilkes Booth. And they did find a lot of pages torn out of it. So there's been a lot of mystery about what was written in the diary of John Wilkes Booth. There's even been some theories that the guy they killed wasn't Booth. It was just some guy who was like an impersonator or something like that. They've had like all kinds of theories about that also as well. So, like I said, the conspirators I told you about, they were later executed. I think I do have a picture showing the different ones being hanged. I think it's somewhere in here, which is right here. So, yeah, those are the four right there, of course, that would be hanged. So, Mary Surratt, she's probably one of the first women in history to be executed for some kind of crime. It's interesting about that. Lewis Power Payne, David Harold, and George Azarat. Oh, they also had John Surratt. He also was implicated as well. That was the son of Mary Surratt. He was believed to be a conspirator involved. He actually fled the country, went to Canada, and I think went to Europe or somewhere. They later extradited him, but he was never prosecuted for being involved. So he kind of got off, more or less, because of the Lincoln assassination. But yeah, because of what happened with Booth, what John Wilkes Booth did, like I said, that really altered, the whole assassination, with the killing of Lincoln, more or less. Now, there is something I did want to talk about that's kind of weird about the Lincoln assassination, which you may have heard about this before, which is very, very famous. But there are a lot of similarities between the Lincoln assassination and the John F. Kennedy assassination. Of course, like I said, those are the two most famous assassinations in history. I've kind of got a few of them here I could kind of throw on the screen for you, which are kind of well known. Both of these, of course, assassinations, a kind of bunch of them got there. Both were slain in the presence of their wives. So both, their wife was there when they got shot, basically. John Wilkes Booth was born in 1839. Lee Harvey Oswald was born in 1939. Both assassins were known by three names, as you can see. Both were Southerners with unpopular ideas, and each name contained 15 letters. Weird. Booth shot Lincoln in a theater and hid in a warehouse or farm. Oswald shot Kennedy from a warehouse and hid in a theater. You can't make it up. Booth and Oswald were murdered before a trial could be arranged. True. Both Lincoln and JFK were succeeded by Southern Democrats. What's weird, both were named Johnson. Can you believe that? Lincoln, it was Andrew Johnson. And as you know, JFK was succeeded by Lyndon B. Johnson. That's weird about that. Although LBJ was from Texas And then, of course, Andrew Johnson was from Tennessee, a little different, but that's kind of true about that also as well. So, Lincoln was elected in 1860. JFK was elected in 1960. Some very strange things about that. Other things I talk about, I remember that was kind of funny, which was Lincoln was shot in Ford's Theater. And then, what was it? JFK was shot in the Lincoln Continental. Kind of weird about that. What was the one I used to joke about that before Kennedy was shot, he was with Maryland, as in Marilyn Monroe. And then before Lincoln was shot, he was in Maryland, as in, state of Maryland. So I don't know. It's kind of jokes about that. But obviously the assassinations aren't funny, really, more or less. But both basically, there's a lot of, conspiracies still about both of them. Obviously, the JFK one is the more famous one that's well known today, that has a lot of conspiracy theories that's still kind of around today overall. All right. So anyway, I'm going to, of course, move on to next talk about, we're going to get into, we'll talk more about Reconstruction today, which I'm going to get into and talk about Andrew Johnson, who, of course, we'll get into Andrew Johnson in the Reconstruction era. And so Johnson comes in next. He's the next president, of course, of the United States, 17th president after Lincoln gets shot. By the way, Lincoln died the next day. So if you want to know the actual assassination date, it's April 15th. It's when he actually died, 1865, 7:22 a.m. Supposedly when Lincoln died, more or less. Who was Andrew Johnson? Johnson was a Democrat from Tennessee who took over the White House. I'll get more into, of course, about the Reconstruction plan and a little bit about his background. Before he became president, a little bit about him. He was actually governor of Tennessee, I think, first before the Civil War. And then during the war, he was like military governor of Tennessee. I'll put it on the screen, but he was governor from, that's it right there. He was governor from like 1862 to 65 is what it is. And then because of the fact that he was, I guess the only, if you know about Johnson, he was the only Democrat senator from the South to support the North during the war. And so because of this, Lincoln decided to put him on the 1864 election ticket with him as his VP. And because he wanted to get votes in the border states, he was running against George McClellan, who was this former general that was under Lincoln. And so it allowed Lincoln to get basically elected with some of those border state votes, more or less. And then, of course, later he's 17th president of the United States, more or less. Now, like I said, he had his own Reconstruction plan, which I'll show you right here. It was called the, a lot of people call it different names, but the common name they usually call it is the so-called 50% plan. I think it's one of the names they dubbed it in the future, like in modern times, so-called 50% plan. So he came up with this idea, and how it worked basically was that he said that half the male voters in a state, like in the South, had to take an oath to the Union. It didn't matter like when it was. I guess it's basically in 1865 or whatever. So they all had to take an oath to the Union. Also, they wouldn't pardon Confederate leaders. So Jefferson Davis, etc., Robert E. Lee, they would not be pardoned under Johnson. They also had to adopt the 13th Amendment, which I think was eventually finalized by the end of the year, December 1865. I think it's when they ratified it or whatever real quick. But that abolished slavery. So all the states basically had to do all of that pretty much under Johnson. But Johnson was controversial. If you know about him, a lot of people thought he was kind of racist, but he was kind of sympathetic toward like the South. And a lot of people didn't trust him, like a lot of the Republicans didn't trust him, because he had taken Lincoln's place. And I think a lot of times he would take bribes, I think, for some people to get pardoned and things like that. So he was kind of known for that, a little being, too sympathetic toward the South. And But he wasn't like big on the planters. If you know about like the planters that owned all the slaves and all that, he didn't really like them, didn't really get along with them. And so that's part of why he had supported the North, in the war. Now, of course, just like Lincoln, he had the same belief that Reconstruction ought to be controlled pretty much by the president. Yeah, he saw it. Yeah, they both were. Yeah, it's weird about that, but yeah, they both had Johnson. It's weird. Yeah, JFK, you had LBJ named Johnson, of course, Lyndon Johnson, and then Lincoln, you had Andrew Johnson. So it's kind of weird about that. So yeah, I know that's kind of funny about that. Maryland and Maryland, you got that. Yeah, that's right before. That's like later. They start flip flopping basically 1960s. That's much later when that'll be. So anyway, so let me also talk about as well how the South looked like after the war, which was not very good. If you know about the South prior to the war, it was pretty devastated. Like the whole issue of the war, like basically the South after the war was like in ruins. Like a lot of your cities you think of. I don't know if you've ever been to Atlanta, right? Atlanta, Georgia, it's a big city, right? It was destroyed. It was burned down, during the war, pretty much. So it was burned down. That was one thing. Also, you had a lot of refugees after the war, African Americans, a lot of whites, also refugees. A lot of women were widows, because all their husbands had been killed, during the war as well. A lot of orphans, too. So a lot of children didn't have any parents or whatever because they, died or whatever during the war. A lot of African Americans lacked jobs, skill. They didn't have any citizenship really. I think maybe they had farm type skills maybe that they had. And so there was a big debate, over, whether, how the South should be reconstructed after the war. And so one of the first things that they, of course, created, if you know about this, after the war, they had all these amendments that they had created first. You had like the 13th Amendment, of course, came out that abolished slavery. And then later on, you're going to have these other amendments that they create too, like the 14th Amendment. We'll get to that later, but that's one of the main issues that leads to why military reconstruction occurs, which 14th Amendment basically gave ex-slaves citizenship. So African Americans got citizenship because of that, because you had, before that, you had the Dred Scott decision, if you remember about that, in 1857, which prevented citizenship for African Americans. That's what that was. 15th Amendment later, of course, will give African American men the right to vote. Is what it'll be, not women, by the way, but just men at the time, more or less. So yeah, all these issues you had after the war, where everything is just burned down, businesses are closed, properties abandoned. It's kind of like right now with the all this deal with the COVID, right, with the virus and all that, how it's kind of affected the economy and all that. And so it's kind of like the same issue, except more devastation, more or less in the South. So yeah, I'm going to get, of course, next into and talk about, especially the Freedmen's Bureau. That's one of the most famous things that really was the first beginning thing that really happened, of course, in Reconstruction, which was the Freedmen's Bureau. And what was that? The Freedmen's Bureau was this relief agency that was created after the Civil War ended. It was created by Congress in March, or at the end of the war, March of 1865, to mostly aid African Americans, former slaves, that had been dispossessed after the war and who were free. But you can see it wasn't just that. It also helped out widows as well, orphans in the war. So it did all that. It dealt with abandoned lands. It set up schools for people like African Americans and others. Schools in the South were also created as well. And the 14th Amendment, I have to look it up later, but it was right. I think 1866 is when the 14th Amendment came out. I believe that's correct. I'll check on that again, but I believe it's 1866 when I think it became official. But I'll check later, but that's probably it. But so it dealt with abandoned lands and schools and things like that, as you can see. also as well. Not just helping out freedmen, but it did that as well. You can see there that the man that was really behind the development of it, and also the running of the Freedmen's Bureau. That's the full name, by the way, Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and also Abandoned Lands. You can see that. You had General Oliver O. Howard. He was the one that basically ran the agency, I think, throughout most of its time for a few years, because it was around until 1872. This agency, it's one of the first in American history, by the way, that helped, like a welfare agency that helps like the poor and disadvantaged, etc. And Howard was very instrumental, if you know about this, in founding what is Howard University, which was founded right after the war. I think in 1867 is the year Washington, D.C. when it was founded. That's considered, as you know, one of the first, historical Black, college and university, HBCUs. You hear about, like Southern University or whatever you got today. It's one of the first to be founded, of course, in the United States. So he helped establish that. He also helped establish, different schools throughout the country, and they help people basically like educate a lot of people, not just helped out people that are dispossessed by the war and things like that. So the only thing about the Freedmen's Bureau, so you can see all the people they educate, 200,000 African Americans were likely educated, because a lot of them couldn't read and write, after the war. So that's something that they were instrumental in doing. But a lot of the Southern, a lot of the white Southerners, of course, tried to restrict African Americans and their rights after the war. But they came up with this thing called the Black Codes that became very famous. The Black Codes. The Black Codes were these restrictive laws to control freedmen or African Americans after the war, primarily for labor. That was the reason for it. This was to control them for like labor issues, because they needed labor, I guess, to till the field still, to grow cotton or whatever after the war. And so a lot of these states in the South kind of brought back their old, slave codes they had before and kind of tweaked them. And you can see there with some of these, laws that they couldn't own property, they couldn't own guns, they didn't have a right to vote. If you didn't have you had no job, you could be arrested and forced to work for no pay. So those are examples of things that were part of the code in a lot of states. Mississippi had the worst restrictive codes they created. They pretty much just took the old slave code of Mississippi and they just got rid of the word slave and they put black or Negro instead. It was like almost the same thing. But they were later banned, if you know about this. And because of the fact that the Democrats have been behind this, what happened was when the Democrats tried to take their seats, I think 1865, 66, they were blocked from taking their seats in Congress. The Republicans did this. And so what happened was after that, what occurred was that basically the Congress took over Reconstruction, is what they did. And so they went to like military congressional Reconstruction, which would follow pretty much, really started in 1867 is when it'll actually be, when this will actually occur. So that's the next thing. And of course, I need to get into, of course, is talk about what happened with, military Reconstruction. We've already talked about, of course, the theories on how the war is about, but I need to talk about the Reconstruction Act of 1867, which really, there it is right there, another 14, 15 million, but I don't know if I have to look it up later where the dates for that. I think 1866 is correct about that, but I'll have to double check on the date of it. But let me go ahead and talk about first about the Reconstruction Act of 1867. Now, wasn't really one act. It was really a bunch of like bills that were kind of compiled together, which had like 5 of them. I think there were total overall. And these were like a series of congressional Reconstruction provisions that were passed over Andrew Johnson's vetoes. If you know about Johnson, he was one of these presidents that was kind of a weak president. And he had like just numerous vetoes that he did during, I forget how many vetoes. He had dozens of vetoes. I know that he did. I forget how many they passed over his vetoes, like overrode him or whatever. And but basically, there were 5 provisions that basically you can see there in that picture. If you look at it, first of all, number 1, they divided all of the southern states into military districts. I've got a map showing you the different districts, but here it is right here. But you can see they divided in all these districts right here. I can give you the, of course, ones on the screen if you want, the ones that were kind of divided up. But basically, Texas and Louisiana were put into one district. You had Arkansas and Mississippi in one. Looks like Georgia, Florida, and Alabama were put in another district. Then you had, of course, you'll notice there, you've got also number 2, South Carolina, North Carolina, and then Virginia was put in a separate district also as well. You'll notice that there's one that's not in there, which is, of course, Tennessee. Tennessee was one of the states that ratified the 14th Amendment. They gave African Americans citizenship. What happened was all the other southern states refused to ratify the 14th Amendment. And so that's part of why they were reconstructed, not just the black codes. So I think 1866, I think it's about when it's getting ratified. You know, like I said, I think they wrote it up in 1865, I believe, but 1866 is when the 14th Amendment, I think, was finally finalized, and, you know, everybody ratified it, all the states. But that's why Tennessee is basically not being military reconstructed like all the other ones. Also, the act in 1867 deprived all ex-Confederates the right to vote. So they couldn't vote. A lot of them were hold office afterwards. Not just like, say, Robert E. Lee or whatever, or, you know, Jefferson Davis, but just about all the Confederates that had fought for the South, they couldn't vote or hold office. They gave freedmen political rights, the right to vote, hold office. So you'll see later on, like for a long time, a lot of them hold office. They draft constitutions in favor of freedmen's rights. They did that too as well. And so then also they were they had to ratify the 14th Amendment. Each state had to do that to pass that and give citizenship to African Americans also as well. I think later they have the 15th Amendment. That's not now. It's a little later when that one comes out. That might be 1868, I think, when it was maybe ratified finally. But so that's basically what's going on. So for the next few years, up to 1870s, you know, you have basically a deal where the South is, you know, military reconstructed after the war. So that's pretty much the bulk of what they do with, you know, Reconstruction, more or less. All right. Now, also, I need to talk about as well, the other thing that happened too was Andrew Johnson, which I'll talk about today, was, if you know about it, was very famous for being one of the first presidents to be impeached, which he was. You have the so-called impeachment in 1868 that's well known. And part of why he got impeached, by the way, was because he was kind of seen as being sympathetic towards the South. He had more of a lenient version of Reconstruction, as you know. He also blocked a lot of aid to the Freedmen's Bureau, which is true. He did that, which is kind of well known as well. And so eventually he was impeached. They had, of course, a famous trial. Of course, I've had several of these trials over the years, obviously, which happened in the Senate, so-called impeachment trial, of course, of Andrew Johnson that occurred May of 1868. But I think the impeachment itself was started by the House of Representatives in February of 1868. Now, why did they impeach Johnson? That's, of course, another thing I need to, of course, talk about. If you just not just because of, you know, that the fact that he was, you know, obviously more lenient toward the South. Well, it was because of this act here you see there called the Tenure of Office Act. That was the reason why they ended up impeaching Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson was not happy about this act that had been passed by Congress. What the Tenure of Office Act did was it basically said that the president cannot basically fire somebody in, like, say, the administration unless they get the approval of Congress, like of the Senate or whatever. And so he thought it was, like, unconstitutional, whatever. And so, if you know what happened, he fired Stanton. I think Stanton, I believe, who was the what was his name? Stanton. Yeah, Stanton. Edwin Stanton, who was the Secretary of War at the time. Edwin Stanton, he had him fired, basically, and he fired Edwin Stanton because Stanton was the one who was running the Reconstruction of the South, like the military reconstruction of it, and he was kind of like an ally of the Radical Republicans while they were in Congress. And so, because of that, they decided to impeach him over that issue. And so it went to trial eventually. And Johnson, like I said, they fell short, just one vote. In fact, Johnson's impeachment, if you know about it, was the closest that it ever came for any president to be found guilty. 35-19, you can see. And, of course, there's been several presidents that, of course, have been impeached. As you know, Bill Clinton, of course, was put on trial for impeachment. Of course, Donald Trump was too, also as well. But none of them were ever found guilty, by the way, of the impeachment charges. So anyway, yeah, that's an interesting note there. Yeah, that's crazy. But anyway, 2013, huh? Yeah, so some of them didn't do it. Yeah, they never did it. It's weird about that. So yeah, that's what happened with Andrew Johnson. But Johnson, after that, was a weak president. And pretty much that's what kind of impeachment does. It kind of weakens, a president pretty much. So Johnson eventually it's going to prevent him from basically running for like re-election. I guess he could have run in 1868 for president, but he was unable to because of the impeachment. So that's one thing that does happen, because of that. So because Andrew Johnson got impeached, he's kind of weak at that point. One of the next things that happened, if you know about that during the Reconstruction era, is, of course, you've got a new president that comes in who's, of course, you see there, Ulysses S. Grant, who's, of course, very famous because of the American Civil War. Yeah, Grant. Right there. And what happened was the Republicans were concerned that they had gone too far with Andrew Johnson, like the impeachment. A lot of people thought it was really unfair, maybe, because Johnson thought that he could, pretty much any president could, like, fire somebody if he wants to, basically, because later on that Office of Tenure Act I told you about was found unconstitutional, like years later. It's not constitutional anymore, if you know about that. And so they picked Grant because he was a war hero. And so Grant comes in, he runs for president in 1868, also runs in 1872, served 2 terms as president. And he campaigned on this campaign, which was referred to as sometimes being called the so-called waving the bloody shirt. And what Grant ran on was the fact that, hey, if you fought for the Union side in the war against the Confederacy, vote for me. And of course, the old slogan was, vote as you shot. And they said, he also had another slogan, which was, let us have peace. I think he also ran on as well. And he ran against the governor of New York, whose name was Horatio Seymour, who had been previously governor before that. And he won in a very close election. I think the electoral votes were not close, as you can see there, but the popular vote was very close in the election. Part of why he won the popular vote was because of African Americans. A lot of them voted for Grant in the election. I want to say a few 100,000, I think, voted for him, basically. And so he was able to win, of course, because of that. Now I'll get into it later, but Grant's administration was one of the most corrupt in American history. It's kind of part of the beginning of the so-called Gilded Age. I'll get to later, probably this week and maybe part of next week. And it's a period in American history from like the 1870s up to the 1890s where the United States is kind of expanding as a country, like westward. You got the beginning of like the industrialization of the country, but there's a lot of corruption in business and also in like the government, which is kind of has to be weeded out later. By the time you get to like the progressive era and all that. And so that'll be later when I kind of get into and talk more about, Grant. I probably won't get as much into Grant now, but we'll talk about him later. But you can see, 500,000 African Americans voted for Grant, Republican. So he won by 100,000 votes. That's it. So we'll get to Grant later, but I'm not going to talk about Grant right now. Let me talk about also for a few minutes too about Reconstruction in the South. As well, just a few minutes on it today. I know I'm not going to be able to finish all of Reconstruction today, but I'll get most good chunk of it done today. But yeah, Reconstruction in the South was dominated by what I guess would be called the so-called Republican allies that were there in a lot of the southern states after the war. These were a bunch of people like carpetbaggers you may have heard of, so-called scallywags. And then, of course, African Americans also were mostly Republicans, after the Civil War ended, more or less. The group you're seeing there, which is probably the most famous one that was in the South, about 2/3 of the Southerners that controlled the South after the war were predominantly what they call carpetbaggers. These were northern-born white Republicans that came down into the South after the war. They kind of took advantage of the situation after the war. A lot of them were viewed as scoundrels, by the way, by people that came down here. But there were some that were good and bad. Some came down for good reasons to help people out, the poor, African Americans, in general, educate them, things like that. Then you had other people that came down and took advantage of people, stole money, stole land, or just got things in unscrupulous ways. More or less. And they were called carpetbaggers because they carried this suitcase that was like made of carpet, it looked like, and so hence the name more or less being used. So carpetbaggers are really the most famous group that really came down, of course, and controlled things more or less. That's how they're viewed. A lot of people, like I said, viewed them as like these scoundrels, more or less negatively. And what was the thing I had about that was very interesting? I think it was Horace Greeley, who was the New York Tribune, summed it up best, where he had some kind of quote that he said that the carpetbaggers were stealing and plundering, many of them with both arms around the blacks and their hands in their rear pockets, seeing if they cannot pick a paltry dollar out of them. So they took advantage of African Americans in the South and took money from them and stuff like that, which is true. But some were good. They had some that were good, some that were bad. That obviously came down to the South. Then you had the scalawags. Actually, too, they were there. Actually, the word scalawag means scoundrel, really. But I guess both were kind of viewed that way sometimes. Both those groups, right there, good or bad. But you had the scalawags. These were Southern-born white Republicans who, by the way, supported the Confederacy. They supported Reconstruction. They were seen as traitors later to white Southerners that had supported the Confederacy as well. So they were also involved in the South as well, in control of it politically, holding offices. And most of those three groups we're talking about, had the right to vote. Nobody else did overall. And then also African Americans, don't forget, they also got a lot of rights during Reconstruction as well. You had a lot of African Americans, not just voting or whatever, but many of them were holding office as well. In fact, a lot of the southern states, they had senators that were in Congress, by the way, or representatives that were, in fact, over 600 legislatures and 16 U.S. congressmen, you can see there, were African American that held power, like in the federal level and also on the local and state levels. as well. You can see those are some of the famous ones that, of course, that were there on the screen. From Mississippi, you had Hiram Revels and Blanche Bruce, who were actually U.S. senators in Mississippi at the same time. That's something you haven't seen, by the way, I think, since, like two black senators, at the same time that you've got. Louisiana, also PBS Pinchback, if you know about him. He was, I think, lieutenant governor at one point. And then I think when I think it was the governor of Louisiana was impeached, I think it was Henry Warmoth, he became governor of Louisiana, PBS Pinchback. And so Pinchback is the only African-American to be governor of Louisiana, which I think was for a couple years, by the way. So anyway, kind of just talking about, some of the things that happened, during Reconstruction as well. Let me talk about one more thing, and I think that might be it for this lecture today. I want to talk about, you also had in the South after the war, if you know about this, you had, we'll get to this later, but a lot of their power is taken away. I'll get to this later, but you're going to have the Ku Klux Klan comes in. They start taking power away, of course, from a lot of supporters of the Republicans and African Americans. As you know, the Ku Klux Klan was considered one of the first white supremacist groups to be founded in the United States. And this was a group, by the way, that was founded in 1867. You can see in Pulaski, Tennessee. In fact, it was founded by Nathan Bedford Forrest. You may have heard of him. He was a famous Confederate cavalry general from Tennessee. That's where he was from. He was also the first Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan as well. Founded there. I think infamous Maxwell House, I think, was the house in Pulaski, Tennessee, where they founded it back then. And a lot of these, white supremacist groups were founded to get white Southerners' rights back because they didn't have a right to vote, a right to hold office. And so they used like terror tactics, violence against African Americans, against people that were Republican, any kind of scalawag, carpetbagger. They also went after them also as well. And there's been different versions of the Klan. The Ku Klux Klan has been around, like I said, for 100-something years, more or less. If you know about it, they would dress up like the ghosts of dead Confederate soldiers. That's why they did that, to scare people. They thought they were ghosts or something like that. And you can see all the tactics that they would use. So they cross burnings, lynchings, physical violence, burning down homes, burning down churches. This stuff they do up to like the civil rights era, the Klan did. The Klan started back then. You can see 1871. You can see they had 500,000. You can see in 1925, 5 million people were actually in the Ku Klux Klan, even spread all over the United States. As far away as like Oregon, they had people in the Ku Klux Klan, more or less. It also became like this nativist organization that hated immigrants, they hated Catholics, they hated Jews. They also were in the temperance prohibition movement too. They wanted to ban alcohol, which is kind of weird, huh? But anyway, so they hated all kinds of groups, the Klan, and but the one we're talking about, this Klan itself, was the one in the 1860s and 70s, like the first Klan of the three, I guess they had. Because the second one was like around World War I, which peaked. And then there's like a third Klan that comes later around the civil rights era, like in the 1950s and 60s. And of course, today there's very few people that are actually in the Ku Klux Klan. I think it's not as many people as it used to be, more or less. And it's just not as popular like it used to be a long time ago. What happened was, part of why the Klan got stamped out was because of a bunch of acts passed under, of course, what is U.S. Grant. You have the Enforcement Acts in 1870-71 that came out, the Enforcement Acts. And what that did was it basically, Grant sent forces into the South to basically break up the Ku Klux Klan. He also sent them down there to protect African Americans and their rights. And so that was one thing that the reason why it did that was to do that. So that helped break up the Klan. First thing it did. And then, of course, the other thing they did, you see on the right, they had the Amnesty Act of 1872. That gave basically political rights back to white Southerners, Democrats that couldn't, vote or hold office before, except for those like high in the Confederacy. So people like, Robert E. Lee and Jefferson and all that, they couldn't get any rights, whatever. But anybody that like an ex-soldier, whatever, that kind of thing, they were given political rights back. And they were later called the so-called redeemers. That's one of the things that they would do, because they would try to redeem themselves and take back power. And that's something you're going to see in the 1870s and 80s in the southern states. The white Southern Democrats are going to re-seize control, is what they'll eventually do at the end of Reconstruction, which ended earlier than it should have done. So anyway, kind of talking about, this is pretty much my first lecture on Reconstruction today. I think I'll probably have a longer lecture, maybe I think on Friday or something later that I'll have, because I'm going to kind of wrap up Reconstruction. But I will talk about on Friday about the rise of the New South. That's one thing that kind of comes out of Reconstruction that you actually have, where you've got, changes like with the racial stuff in the South, like racial segregation starts. You've heard of Jim Crow, right? We'll talk about Jim Crow, something that, of course, comes out of the South that's well known, more or less. Also, agricultural changes, industrial changes. I'll get into that as well on Friday. So I don't have a lecture posted yet for an announcement about that, but I'll do that later today. Send you out an announcement about the next lecture that's upcoming. But on Friday, I'll kind of wrap up Reconstruction, and I'm going to kind of get into the so-called Gilded Age, which I'll talk about, like corruption, politics that happened in the late 19th century, like under Grant's administration and after. So I'll get into that. And so that'll be the next thing I'll kind of talk about later in the week. So I am going to have a quiz later that'll be on Reconstruction, which I'll probably give you on Friday, but I'll have to have a part 2 lecture on that, which will be later for you to finish that up. So I only have one part so far that's really been done. So before I go, don't forget that for this week, like week 1, the pre-test needs to be, of course, completed. Of course, I told you Thursday, I think 12 noon, try to get that done. That's going to be, of course, count as the attendance for week 1, more or less. And then don't forget the contract policy page. Either upload that or just email me that you pretty much agree to my syllabus for the semester. And I don't know if anybody else had any other questions. I guess Taylor, I don't know if you have a question in StreamYard. Anybody else have a question that they had? Do you get bonus points for live? Yes, you do. I think it's usually 3 points a live stream is what I usually do. Yes. Yes, correct. 3 points a live stream, of course. If you ask me any comments, questions later, of course, about the lecture, you also could get bonus points also as well. So you can earn bonus points for, ask me questions, of course, about the lectures. So yeah, glad once you asked a lot of questions, about the lecture. Well, that's good about that. Later on, if you have any other, comments, questions about the lecture, let me know, later in the week or whenever you want to about that. So that's it for today. If anybody else has any, questions about the class, like administrative thing or whatever it is, you need to know, or of course you have decided what you want to do for your research paper, just email me at the email address I've given you, simond@mybrcc.edu. Oh, anybody's also interested in the Veterans Project I've talked about too, let me know also about that. So that's it for today. Like I said, I'll see you on Friday, of course, for another lecture. 1 p.m. likely is when I'm going to stream it, of course, also as well. So after the stream, this lecture should be posted on my YouTube channel. So y'all take care, and I'll see you Friday. So see you later.